Let us see the important events leading to Black American civil rights movement. During the Reconstruction era, 1865 to 1877, that followed the Civil War, amendments to the United States Constitution were passed to help the country rebuild and to alter American society, government, and politics. The 13th Amendment, 1865, abolished slavery and involuntary servitude, except for those duly convicted of a crime. The 14th Amendment, 1868, gave black people citizenship rights and equal protection of the laws for all persons. The 15th Amendment, 1870, gave black male the right to vote, prohibiting discrimination on the basis of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. It was believed that it was possible to transform United States from a country that was half slave and half free to one where the entire population, including the formerly enslaved and their descendants, would have constitutionally guarantee of liberty. The enforcement of these amendments came to a standstill due to the following factors. A. As part of the Compromise of 1877, which ended federal interference in Southern affairs, led to withdrawal of the troops stationed in the South. B. Some states in 1876 and after that passed Jim Crow laws that limited the rights of African Americans. C. The Supreme Court decisions that undermined these amendments were the Slaughterhouse cases in 1873, which cancelled rights guaranteed under the 14th Amendment, and the Pelcy versus Ferguson case in 1896, which established the constitutionality of separate passenger cars in railroads, but equal facilities for black and white people, giving federal approval to Jim Crow's laws. Thus, white supremacy was reinstitutionalized in the South. What is racial segregation? Racial segregation, the practice of restricting people to certain circumscribed areas of residence or to separate institutions and facilities on the basis of race. Racial segregation provides economic advantage and superior social status of the politically dominant group, and this was used by the white population to maintain their superiority over other groups by means of legal and social color bars. The pursuit of civil rights for black Americans was inspired by the promise of democracy and by the Declaration of Independence, which stood for equality of all people and of the inalienable rights of all people to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The civil rights movement was initiated by Southern blacks in the 1950s and 1960s to break the prevailing pattern of racial segregation. Some of the key events and rulings in the history of the Black American Civil Rights Movement. First, Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, 1954. On May 17, 1954, the United States Supreme Court ruled that racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional and granted equal education to Black Americans. While the ruling implied only to public schools, it implied that segregation in other public facilities was unconstitutional as well. Second, Rosa Parks and Montgomery bus boycott, 1955. On December 1st, 1955, African American civil rights activist Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a public bus to a white passenger. Her arrest led to a sustained bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama. The protest began on December 5th, led by Martin Luther King Jr. and others, which lasted for over a year. The boycott ended on December 20th, 1956, after the Supreme Court upheld the lower court's ruling that segregated seating on public buses was unconstitutional. Third, the Little Rock Nine and the Little Rock Central High School integration, 1957. In September 1957, 9 African American students attended their first day at Little Rock Central High School. This school's student population until that point had been white. These 9 students encountered a large white mob and soldiers from the Akunwas National Guard sent by Governor Fansbus. For 18 days, President Eisenhower, Governor Fansbus, and Little Rock's Mayor Woodrow Mann discussed the situation. The students returned protected by United States soldiers. Although the students were harassed, but they completed the academic year. Fourth, the Greensboro 4 and the Sit-in Movement, 1960. On February 1st, 1960, a group of 4 African American students from the Agricultural and Technical College of North Carolina began a sit-in movement in downtown Greensboro. After making purchases at the F.W. Woolworth department store, they sat at the whites-only lunch counter. They were refused service and asked to leave. The Greensboro 4 remained seated until closing and returned the next day with about 20 other black students. The sit-in grew, and when protesters were arrested, others would take their places. After months of protests, facilities began to desegregate throughout the country, and the Greensboro Woolworths started to serve African American patrons from July. Fifth, Freedom Rides, 1961. On May 4, 1961, Freedom Rights, a group of 7 African Americans and 6 white people boarded 2 buses bound for New Orleans. The Freedom Rights used facilities for the opposite race as their buses made stops along the way. The group met with violence, and when one bus stopped to change a slashed tire, the vehicle was firebombed and the Freedom Riders were beaten. This was done to test whether the Supreme Court's ruling banning segregated interstate bus travel also extended to include bus terminals and restrooms. Their successful efforts led to U.S. Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy ordering the Interstate Commerce Commission to enforce bans on segregation more strictly. Sixth, March on Washington, 1963. The demonstrations of 1963 culminated with the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom to protest civil rights abuses and employment discrimination. A crowd of about 250,000 individuals had gathered at the National Mall in Washington, D.C. to listen to speeches by civil rights leaders. I Have a Dream speech by Martin Luther King Jr. became one of the defining moments of the civil rights movement. The Supreme Court's ruling in 1955 did not change anything. De jure segregation continued and therefore resulted in the need for civil rights movement. The various non-violent protest groups like the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the Southern Christian Leadership Organization, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and Congress of Racial Equality, as well as other organizations, worked towards finding peaceful methods of forcing the government to act and end the de jure segregation for good. Martin Luther King Jr.'s iconic speech, I Have a Dream, in the civil rights movement of America, and the efforts of various organizations persuaded President Lyndon B. Johnson to sign the Civil Rights Act 1964 into law. The Civil Rights Act was proposed by President John F. Kennedy in 1963. Although Kennedy was unable to secure passage of the bill in Congress, a stronger version was passed by President Johnson. This act authorized the federal government to prevent racial discrimination in employment, voting, and the use of public facilities. With the signing of the Civil Rights Bill into law on July 2, 1964 by President Johnson, white groups opposed to integration with African Americans responded in the form of protests, increased support for pro-segregation candidates for public office, racial violence, and challenged the constitutionality of the act, which was upheld by the Supreme Court in the case. Heart of Atlanta and McClung, in which the court upheld the public accommodations provisions of the 1964 Civil Rights Act on the ground that Congress had the authority to enforce civil rights legislation under the Commerce Clause because segregation in public accommodations affected interstate commerce. Seventh, Selma March 1965. On March 7, 1965, Martin Luther King Jr. organized a march from Selma, Alabama to the state's capital, Montgomery, to protest the blocking of Black Americans the right to vote by the Jim Crow laws in the South. The state troopers sent marchers back with violence and tear gas. On March 9th, King tried again, leading marchers to the Pettus Bridge, where they encountered state troopers. King led his followers to kneel in prayer and then he turned back. This prompted President Johnson to introduce voting rights legislation, and the Voting Rights Act was signed into law on August 6, 1965. It suspended literacy tests, provided for federal approval of proposed changes to voting laws or procedures, and directed the Attorney General of the United States to challenge the use of poll tax for state and local elections. Television broadcasts showing hyper-violent response against demonstrators played a major role in increasing Northern support for the civil rights movement. 8. What's Right? 1965. Violence, fires, and looting broke out on August 11, 1965, after a white police officer arrested a black man on suspicion of driving while intoxicated. This violence resulted in 34 deaths, more than 1,000 injured, and $40 million worth property was damaged. President Johnson created the McCone Commission to identify the causes of the unrest. It cited that violence was directly a reaction to the economic challenges that African Americans faced in urban areas like poor housing, schools, and job prospects. Ninth, Black Panther Party founded 1966. On February 21, 1965, prominent black leader Malcolm X, who spoke out on civil rights movement, which contributed to the development of black nationalist ideology and the Black Power movement, was assassinated while lecturing at the Audubon Ballroom in Harlem, New York. In the wake of his assassination, Black Panther Party was founded by Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale in Oakland, California, to protect African American neighborhoods from police brutality. The party launched many community programs like legal aid, transportation assistance, free shoes, and resolving economic problems of the African Americans. 10. Loving versus Virginia, 1967. Richard Loving, a white man, and Mildred Jeter, a woman of mixed African American and Native American ancestry, had pleaded guilty to having violated Virginia state law prohibiting a white person and a colored person from leaving the state to be married and returning to live as man and wife. Their 1 year prison sentence was suspended on the condition that the couple leave Virginia and not return for 25 years. Once they settled in Washington, D.C., the couple filed in a Virginia state court in 1963. On June 12, 1967, the U.S. Supreme Court ruling invalidated laws against interracial marriage in Virginia and 15 other states. 11. Detroit Riot 1967. Violent confrontation between residents of predominantly black neighborhoods and city police in Detroit began on July 23, 1967 after a raid at an illegal drinking club where police arrested everyone inside, including African Americans. The violence spread, resulting in 43 deaths, hundreds injured, thousands burned buildings, and many arrested. President Johnson created the Kerner Commission to identify the causes of unrest. It cited racism, discrimination, and poverty were the causes for unrest and warned that our nation is moving towards two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. 12. New York Riots 1967. The civil unrest that erupted in New York, New Jersey in July 1967 was due to the arrest and beating in custody of a local cab driver, John William Smith. During the conflict, the National Guard was called in to occupy the streets with tanks and troops. The violence resulted in 26 deaths, hundreds were injured, thousands arrested, and millions of dollars of property was destroyed. 13th, assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. 1968. On April 4, 1968, King was assassinated. His murder set off riots in various cities across the country. This paved the way for the Fair Housing Act on April 11, 1968. The legislation made it unlawful for sellers, landlords, and financial institutions to refuse to rent, sell, or provide financing for a house based on factors other than an individual's financial resources.